I'm Fergus Murray, one of the founding members of AMAZE, the Autistic Mutual Aid Society, Edinburgh. I'm also a science teacher and a writer, and I consult with the University of Edinburgh on various autism-related projects. I want to talk here about the work of AMAZE, how we got started, and the role of AMAZE and other autistic people's organisations in protecting the rights of autistic people. AMAZE exists for three things: the autistic community. We run autistic pride picnics. We've run autistic-led late identification groups for people who discover late in life that they're autistic. Various other social events. Education. We've run workshops for the University of Edinburgh, COSLA, service provider, Larch, various others, including workshops for the general public. And thirdly, advocacy. Ensuring autistic perspectives are represented and the concerns of autistic people are taken seriously when it comes to decision making that affects us. As in our mental health report, Too Complicated to Treat, our participation in the cross-party group on autism, and our involvement in the Scottish Government's working group on autism in teacher education. We also took part in the recent independent review of the Mental Health Act. Now, we founded AMAZE in 2017 after attending the late diagnosis group at number 6, which at that time was run by non-autistic staff members. That's since changed. It felt like it was a lot about what's wrong with being autistic, which is something that people tend to hear a lot about after receiving an autism diagnosis. It's even there in the word diagnosis. And the literature on autism is overwhelmingly focused on deficits. Things which are apparently wrong with us. And very little on the positive sides of autism. How what look like deficits from some angles might just be different ways of doing things, which are not necessarily any worse. And also very little on the social context of autism as a disability, where so many of the things that we find difficult are hard because society is not set up for people who process the world differently. The most valuable thing about that late diagnosis group was the opportunity to connect with other autistic people. Folks who've had similar life experiences, faced some of the same challenges, and inevitably come up with their own coping strategies. It seemed weird for the group to be facilitated by someone who had no personal experience of any of that. My partner Sunny and I attended Autscape, an annual conference and retreat run by autistic people for autistic people. And we found that meeting dozens of other autistic people in a space designed to prioritise autistic needs and communication styles was transformative. Socialising doesn't have to be a strain, it turns out, and meeting someone who's kind of on your wavelength doesn't have to be something that only happens every few years. After we came back, we volunteered to run autistic-led late identification sessions for number 6. And that's Edinburgh's Autism One-Stop Shop, for those who don't know it. Introducing autistic people to the autistic community and encouraging people to share their experiences and ways that they found of dealing with them, and for living in a world which so often feels like it's not made for us. And that led to us co-founding AMAZE with some of the people that we met through it, as a way to formalise what we were doing and branch out into training and advocacy, partly inspired by Autistic Rights Group Highland, ARG, which had been doing that kind of thing for years. It was clear that too much about autism was happening without autistic people, and that as a result, autistic people's needs were not being understood and our rights were not being respected. So why does the failure to include autistic people in decisions and training about autism lead to so many violations of autistic rights? There are several dimensions to this, reflected in AMAZE's threefold mission that I was just talking about. Developing autistic community, advocating for autistic perspectives, and educating wider society. The human rights of autistic people are protected by several pieces of legislation, both domestic and international, for example the Equality Act 2010, but I'm going to be drawing here mainly on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD, to which the Scottish Government is a signatory, as is the Westminster Government. Not all autistic people see themselves as disabled, but the relevant legal protections should still apply to all of us. Among the rights guaranteed by the CRPD is the right to full inclusion and participation in the community. In a world where studies have shown that many people react badly to autistic people within seconds of meeting us, and where social misunderstandings are all too common, and usually blamed entirely on the autistic side, many autistic people face isolation in social life, both as children and as adults. Autistic-led organisations are uniquely well placed to remedy that and ensure that autistic people get the chance to meet and interact with peers as equals. Getting the chance to interact in ways that feel natural to us, to put our masks down, stop pretending to be neurotypical, and communicate with people who have a good chance of getting us intuitively. Only autistic-led groups can do this without putting people in a position of like a service user relying on a charity, which can be quite disempowering. And I'd suggest also that many autistic people have a much better handle on what autistic people need than all but a tiny minority of neurotypicals. And yet, in much of Scotland, there is nothing in place to put autistic adults in contact with each other, and very little to make sure that autistic kids understand how many others there are out there having similar experiences. Various studies have demonstrated the importance of these connections, including recent findings by Catherine Crompton and the team at Edinburgh University, which highlight the need for autistic-led opportunities and indicate benefits of informal peer support for autistic adults. Something that anyone involved in the autistic community already knew. Autistic people's organisations could do a huge amount to meet autistic people's right to full inclusion and participation in the community, with relatively little by way of resources, a meeting space or two, some help with admin maybe. It might take more resources to ensure that autistic people's human rights are met in the fields of education, healthcare and policing. But these are of course all critically important, and autistic-led organisations have a central role to play in improving outcomes here as well. That's because training is the best tool that we have to achieve that goal. And autism training should always be designed and delivered mainly by autistic people. We have the ability to speak from personal experience. We have insight into what we most need professionals to know. We're more likely to identify and correct misconceptions and outdated ideas. Training delivered by autistic professionals also gives people a chance to meet us as equals, which many just don't have the chance to do in day-to-day life. And crucially, it's the opportunity to ask us questions about our lives and how we see things. In our experience, such training is consistently very well received. Another right enshrined in the CRPD is the right for disabled people to be consulted with and actively involved in decision-making processes concerning issues relating to us through our representative organisations. The UN committee overseeing the CRPD is very clear that this means disabled-led organisations, which makes a lot of sense. Organisations that are run by people who are not autistic themselves, like the big autism charities in Scotland, might do a lot of good work, but it's hard to see how they could ever claim to represent us. Autistic people spot problems and see things from perspectives that non-autistic people usually miss. There is, of course, a place for parents and professionals to be heard in matters relating to autism, but they should not dominate the conversation if they have no experience of being autistic themselves, when there are autistic people out there who can talk and explain our perspective on the world. And especially given that a lot of autistic people are parents themselves, or professionals, or both. But so far, it's the big charities, which mainly started as organisations for parents, that government bodies tend to turn to for advice. And to be fair, they are the ones that always have the resources to give it, but that's not really an excuse. Autistic people and our representative organisations should be actively involved in all decision-making about autism, for good practical reasons, as well as for reasons of international law. That means budgeting for our time and talking to autistic people right from the start to help set priorities and flag up any problems before committing to a course of action. It also means ensuring that you've done everything you can to make procedures, committees, conferences, and so on accessible to autistic people. Ensure clear and detailed information is available well ahead of time. Make sure that lights aren't too bright. Talk to autistic people about what you need to do to include them before you fully plan these things. If you only involve a small number of autistic individuals chosen by non-autistic people rather than representative organisations, or you consult them only after major decisions have been made, any involvement is likely to feel tokenistic. At its worst, this can be even worse than not involving autistic people at all. It gives a veneer of authenticity without bringing any of the benefits that come from empowering autistic people in these processes, and it exhausts those taking part. The Scottish Government has repeatedly affirmed its commitment to its obligations under the UN CRPD, which hopefully means that whatever replaces the Scottish Strategy for Autism next year will actively involve autistic people, and particularly our representative organisations, at every stage, from setting priorities, to delivering any necessary training, to overseeing implementation. For that to be practical, these organisations are likely to need resources that we don't currently have, as well as a shift in priorities from government bodies tasked with developing and implementing policies. Non-autistic people are at a natural disadvantage when it comes to understanding autistic experiences. It's not your fault, you just are. And allowing non-autistic people to dominate conversations about autism has not worked out great so far, as you can see from the statistics on autistic unemployment, suicide, school exclusions, and access to physical and mental health care. Scotland can do much better than this, and we must. With autistic people empowered to share our insights and help people to make better decisions about autism, it will. Thank you.